series. This evening's topic is addressing inclusion content and practices in the Introduction to Early Childhood course in most early childhood education curriculum. I'm Bill McInerney, co-director of the Partner Project, and welcoming you to the webinar tonight. Please note that some of the content in the slide presentation has been accessed from content on the web and edited. Okay, so as I mentioned, our focus tonight is including content related to inclusion in the Introduction to Early Childhood course. Obviously, there are multiple courses in the early childhood education curriculum. The Partner Project's current focus is two-year associate degree program, so we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 additional courses and experiences in the entire early childhood curriculum. The Introduction to Early Childhood Education is obviously one of the early core courses and basically serves as an introduction to early childhood education majors to the field of early childhood ed. There are a couple of sample course descriptions here from two different syllabi talking about what should be included in the comprehensive survey course. Providing students with an understanding of the complexity of the field, developing an awareness of the diversity of the field, we'll talk a bit about that in the webinar. Understanding the diversity of children and the populations with whom early childhood professionals work. In Seminar 4, Dr. Dinnerby will address these issues about diversity. We'll revisit that a bit with some different types of resources. Between the two seminars, Webinar 4 and 5, you should be able to access quite a bit of information about diversity of young children. A component of the Introduction to Early Childhood course would be providing the opportunity to apply knowledge to young children and their families within a variety of early childhood settings. A different Introduction to Early Childhood course contains similar content. It's about developmentally appropriate practices in a variety of child care settings, identification of effective multicultural and inclusive early childhood learning environments, and recognizing the importance of integrated curriculum. We will talk in more detail about this inclusive early learning environment with respect to the current NAEYC standards for preparation of personnel and what has been identified as an emphasis on inclusion among several other factors. So, based on those two course descriptions, it appears that an Introduction to Early Childhood Education course should include some of this content. First of all, certainly the legal mandates for early intervention and early education, and we will differentiate further in the webinar between early intervention and early education or early childhood special education. Also, background information describing the public agencies, in this case in Ohio, who are charged with identifying and serving young children with special needs. Other relevant content would include awareness of the scope of early intervention and early childhood special education service delivery options, which once again we'll address further along in the webinar. The range of ability and disability conditions of children who are eligible for enrollment, this will also be addressed in the webinar, as well as implications for professional practice. And also we'll look at the scope or the range of programs in which young children with special needs can be served under the current version of IDEA, the federal law which governs early intervention and early childhood special education. And we'll talk a little bit about the service delivery models in Ohio and how they relate to this particular content. So let's look at the current NAEY standards for initial and advanced early childhood professional preparation programs. These are the 2010 standards, and which of those standards might be relevant to Introduction to an Early Childhood Education course. I just identified 4. There are obviously others depending on the orientation and the faculty to the content in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course. In comparing two courses, two syllabi from the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course to two different community college, it appears that there isn't an absolute match between the content in the syllabi. I'm not clear what the directions are statewide with respect to fidelity across syllabi in the same, in this case, 2-year associate degree programs or 4-year licensure programs for that matter. certainly there's a little bit of wiggle room, so to speak, but I think we will probably come to an agreement in the webinar tonight that certain of the content we're discussing does appear to be relevant in the Introduction to Early Childhood course. Two other courses where some of this content might be appropriate. One would be the Child Development course, which once again Dr. Dinnebiel addressed in the May webinar number 4, and also some of this content might also be appropriately embedded in a course on public or program policies and administration, which I know at least one community college has that course in their early childhood education curriculum. So a key difference in the 2010 NAEYC standards are that between the 2001, 2002, and 2003 standards, and I emphasize this with the color change in the statement, NAEYC has included a strengthened emphasis on academic content diversity, inclusion, technology, and an early childhood focus. So our specific focus tonight is inclusion, and apparently we're in good stead with the current NAEYC guiding standards for initial and advanced preparation. So standard 1B, knowing and understanding the multiple influences on early development and learning. Once again, having reviewed our webinar number 4 with Dr. Dinnebiel, there is some content related to that, and we'll also address that a bit tonight. Standard 1C, using this knowledge to create healthy, respectful, supportive, and challenging learning environments, which once again are reflected in least restrictive environment placements, which we will discuss further. Standard 6D, integrating knowledgeable, reflective, and critical perspectives. And 6E, engaging in informed advocacy for children in the profession, and certainly awareness of those programs who are designated by law as responsible for early intervention in early childhood special education, and specifically within Ohio, those agencies who are designated as providers of those services is important information for an early childhood education teacher to know in order to become an informed advocate. So the challenge to early childhood education faculty, before we get into the actual content tonight, I just wanted to set up an analysis, so to speak, or talking points, so as you consider what elements, if any, of these webinars are appropriate for consideration for embedding in your current courses. Just exactly what is the challenge inherent in enhancing the early childhood education curriculum, specifically with respect to including content and field experiences related to current practices in inclusive early childhood special education. So the challenge to early childhood education faculty in expanding and enhancing the early childhood education teacher education curriculum is to recognize and accept the changing landscape of early childhood education. Early childhood education is not what it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I believe it's safe to say that current practice, as well as current forces in our society, at this particular point, are strongly encouraging a more inclusive experience in early childhood education for all children, including children with disabilities. So the challenge to the early childhood education faculty is to organize key curriculum components so that there's a systematic and developmental sequence of exposure to this content and these experiences on the part of the early childhood education students. There's a few factors we should look at when we're talking about early childhood education faculty collaborating in enhancing teacher education programs. So let's look first at student perceptions of content related to inclusion. This is going to come up in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course. The issue is just what is the charge, what is the scope, what is the purview of early childhood education? Who are the children that these teachers can expect to encounter and can expect to be in their classrooms? And it's important in an early course like the Introduction to Early Childhood Education to test the waters and to elicit from students what their perceptions are of the scope of early childhood education. There can be a lot of misinformation, maybe some dated information, maybe some wishful thinking, maybe some inaccurate information. And we'll press forward with that. So let's start with this premise. Most early childhood education students, obviously, and at this point I'm talking about associate degree and four-year degree students, have had limited experience with young children with special needs. And those students who've had relevant experiences by working in child care, preschool, Head Start, etc., probably had what I'm calling unguided experiences that didn't include meaningful communication with early childhood special education professionals or related services professionals. So they may have had some interactions with young with special needs, maybe the parents of these children and the like, but once again, it probably wasn't an informed, critically analyzed, or guided experience. Let's also accept that some early childhood education majors don't have a keen interest in working with young children with special needs. They're seeking to enter the profession and work with young children who are typically developing. This is not unlike a lot of the four-year teachers who are in the K-12 field in what we call regular general education. Their specific interest is not in working with children with special needs, and I can understand that, and I would expect most of you can as well. Some of these students in early childhood education may be somewhat resistant, at least initially, to exposure to information and critical inclusion. They also might not welcome additional elements that are embedded in course and field assignments that require them to address the characteristics, competencies, and needs of young children with special needs. So I think we need to understand this. We obviously need to address this. We need to help students understand that within the profession they're about to enter, it's probably not viable to have a position in which one expresses no interest in interacting with young children with special needs, just because of the probabilities that in most classrooms, most early childhood classrooms, there will in fact be children who are at risk or identified with special needs. Let's also keep in mind, however, that as we'll see in further slides, the percentage of children in early childhood education programs who are either at risk, identified with disabilities, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20%. So it's not improbable that there will be children with special needs in a preschool classroom. Let's also keep in mind that there needs to be a balance. Most of the children in preschool classrooms and the focus of the attention of most early childhood teachers are going to be typically developing children. So this enhancement and this focus and this interest in inclusion that should be mirrored through all of the courses in the program is not at the exclusion of balanced content in the more general early childhood education curriculum. As I just mentioned, high probabilities of there being young children in any preschool classroom who either are receiving special ed services or may be on their way to eligibility for special education services. And despite the possibility that some ECE early childhood education students may not be interested in inclusion, and once again they may clearly and vocally communicate to us that they're really interested in working with young children who are developing typically, or they may have some type of an emerging or in some cases a firm belief that inclusion doesn't work for all children. Regardless of those positions, as a faculty and as a program, it's incumbent upon us to address the idea of curriculum enhancement and inclusion in particular. So early childhood education faculty involved in this enhancement process must be awareness, but we also need to understand that the expected outcomes for students in associate degree programs, even more so than in four-year degree programs, are entry-level skills. And in this case, these are entry-level skills once again with the community college focus, that are not to be confused with the entry-level skills of an individual completing a four-year degree program resulting in licensure by the Ohio Department of Education. So the other side of the coin is, what are the potential or the range of perceptions of faculty in early childhood education programs with respect to inclusion and its role in early childhood education programs. There may be some early childhood education faculty who also might evidence some comfort and discomfort in being asked to include information and content about young children with special needs in course content, assignments, and field assignments. This can be related to their personal lack of academic preparation, or positive or negative or confusing professional experiences that they had relating to young children with special needs. So I guess the point being here that the larger the faculty, for example, in early childhood teacher preparation, there may be some faculty members who themselves are not personally strong advocates of the process of inclusion. And that's just simply a reality that we all need to be aware of. You know, this discomfort may be related to previous experiences with special needs children in child care or preschool or Head Start. But the net effect may be that some early childhood education faculty may have a belief system that does not support inclusion as a positive development in early childhood education. We once again just need to understand that, and we need to be responsive and be open to those kind of comments as we plan curriculum enhancement. And you know, regardless of our previous experiences or personal professional opinions, we need to understand that inclusion is a component of early childhood education, and as a result needs to be a component of the preparation of teachers who will be the lead teachers in these classrooms. So here's a position statement as once again a talking point before we move into the actual content of an introduction to early childhood education course that might serve as a springboard for conversation. Yeah, I think we're all aware that the models and mandates for early education, child care, and early intervention have changed as a result of contemporary political, social, and legal forces. And that to ensure that future graduates of early childhood education, personnel preparation, or teacher preparation programs are prepared to meet the needs of all children, we have no choice but to inform these teachers of the future that awaits them. Even if we can't fully understand that same future or are uncomfortable perhaps with emerging and projected paradigms of early care and education, there have been a lot of changes that have occurred, and the odds are we'll continue to move in that direction as you see the broader changes that are occurring across the social landscape and political landscape in the United States. And it's important to keep in mind, while the process of curriculum enhancement with respect to including materials and assignments and field-related experiences that are related to young children with disabilities and inclusion, even though the process is comprehensive, it's not complex. So faculty need to make decisions about, within their early childhood education teacher preparation program, what's the scope of content and skills that are related to inclusion. And once again, these decisions are driven or guided or shaped by NAEYC and the Council for Exceptional Children Division of Early Childhood, CECDC, guidelines for program standards. And both of those organizations, which are the largest advocacy organizations for early childhood and early childhood special ed, early intervention, respectively, created these guidelines jointly with respect to program standards, etc. So in a sense, we can run, but we can't hide. Our guiding professional advocacy organizations have collaborated in developing a set of unified standards to guide our direction as preparers of future teachers. So the process of curriculum enhancement, what does it include? Sequencing for introduction and refinement of content and skills within the early childhood program course and field experience sequence. In other words, and very specifically, as a faculty, we need to understand, okay, if we're going to identify certain content and skills and experiences, which content is introductory, which is advanced, where are skills acquired, where are they refined and practiced. We need to identify where this is going to occur in the curriculum, when it's going to occur in the curriculum, where being as in fields or as in courses, as in field placements, when as in, early on in the 1,000 level courses, up in the 2,000 level courses, and how. Will this be accomplished by specific content that will be embedded in the course syllabi related to inclusion in young children with special needs? Will it also involve modification or additional assignments? Will it also involve modification or additional assignments in course-related field experiences and in the student teaching practicum? And these are some of the questions that a faculty would need to address in making decisions about how to move forward with curriculum enhancement. So as I mentioned, while the changes are comprehensive, are complex, they're not inscrutable. There is a template. There are some directions. There are some benchmarks we can examine as we move to enhance the curriculum content in the early childhood education teacher preparation program. And I should point out, some of you may be new to a webinar, all of this content will reappear in a YouTube format with the audio overlay, just as we're going through right now in the live webinar. In addition to that, the PowerPoint and the other PowerPoints will be posted through the Partner Project website in a location where you can access the PowerPoints, download the PowerPoints, open the PowerPoints, and then selectively pull out certain slides if you think they're appropriate, relevant, and you want to include them in your courses. So we're attempting to really build a better mousetrap, so to speak. We're attempting to make life easier for the individuals participating in a webinar. We're providing you with kind of a seminar experience, so to speak, an interactive experience where that's appropriate as we go through the content, but also the materials archived so you can access it and review it and rerun it and do what you'd like. And perhaps more importantly, you can access some of the PowerPoint content either for resource references in the future and or simply taking that PowerPoint content and moving it right into your course presentations. Okay, so now let's get into some examples of inclusive content that can be appropriately embedded in the Introduction to Early Childhood course in the early childhood education curriculum. So let's start by looking at legal mandates for early intervention and early education, and then some background information describing which public agencies, specifically in Ohio, are charged with identifying and serving young children with special needs. The two key elements of the IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act of 2004, which describe the range of services to be offered to children ages birth through 22 in Ohio. The two aspects of this we're most concerned about, even though the early childhood education program cohort is birth to age 8, the two elements we're most concerned with in the early childhood education teacher preparation program is Part C of IDEA, which is birth to 3 services, and Part B, Section 619, which is the services for preschool children with special needs, ages 3 to 5. So let's start with looking at the promise of the federal law IDEA. Once again, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. The initial version was passed in 1975, and there have been several reauthorizations and revisions during that period. And the current IDEA law that states operate under is a 2004 reauthorization. So here's 3 basic points. All children with disabilities, and all is bolded and italicized because the law clearly means all children regardless of degree or extent of disability. All children with disabilities are entitled to 1, a free and appropriate public education, the acronym is called FAPE. 2, that free and appropriate public education should occur in the least restrictive environment. The relevant acronym there is LRE. And the third component is that this free appropriate public education that occurs in the least restrictive environment is guided by either an individual education plan for, in our case, 3 to 5-year-olds, or 3 to 8-year-olds if you want to expand that band, or the individualized family service plan, which relates to infants, toddlers, and their families, infants and toddlers birth to age 3. So here's just a brief overview of the Part C section of IDEA. Services for children under the age of 3, with some exceptions. But the target are urgent and substantial need to in early intervention, recognizing significant brain development that occurs during these early years, and the need to maximize the potential for individuals with disabilities to live independently. So this is very proactive. We're not talking obviously about 2.5-year-olds living independently. What we're saying is this investment of time and effort can be best understood if we look further down the line at the benefits of early intervention, where we see adolescents, young adults, and mature adults who may be able to live and participate in this society with a lesser need for support and intervention as a result of early intervention provided when they were infants and toddlers. So key aspects of these early developmental services under Part C, they're provided under public supervision, provided at no cost except, once again, where regulations allow, and designed to meet the needs of young children with, at least in most states, the definition is an identified and substantial delay in one or more developmental domains, and we'll look at that in a minute. These are the charges from the federal law. Early intervention services must be based on scientific research, as in practices which are supported by evidence that they do, in fact, support the development of young children and their families. We talked about the IFSP, the primary document in Part C services. A comprehensive child find system to identify children birth to 3 who are at risk or have disabilities and are eligible for services. Public awareness programs, a directory of services, and a comprehensive system of personnel development for early intervention providers and related services professionals. So once again, just so early childhood education majors understand, there is in fact a federal law well defined with a broad scope that affects, guides, and shapes early intervention services for young children with special needs or disabilities, developmental delays, in at-risk categories who are ages birth to 3. Every infant toddler in Ohio who meets certain eligibility requirements is eligible for, once again, free and appropriate early intervention services in each of the 88 counties in Ohio. The federal law requires every state to have an early intervention lead agency, and in Ohio, out of the Ohio Department of Health, the lead agency is the Help Me Grow group, and we'll talk about that resource in a second. Here's some basic information about additional responsibilities of the early intervention lead agency as described in the federal law. And once again, at the bottom of this slide, we see once again the federal mandate that services be provided in natural environments or most appropriate settings as determined by parents and members of the individual family service plan, or IFSP team. So Child Find requires all school districts to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities, including some of those children with, living in those situations. And a child does not have to have a specific disability label. We'll see what that means a little further down. When children are 6 to 22, we identify them as having a specific disability or category of disability. That is not a requirement under federal law for younger children. So who qualifies as an infant or toddler with a disability? There's a basic definition. The child is experiencing developmental delays or has a diagnosed physical or mental condition that has a high probability of resulting in developmental delay. So for example, a condition that you're all familiar with, Down syndrome. We know historically that a significant number of children with Down syndrome will require early supports and lifelong supports because of the effects of the condition of Down syndrome. We know that Down syndrome is indeed associated with lifelong developmental delay. Other conditions where it's not clear, but we're certainly concerned, would be cerebral palsy. We're not sure the outcome immediately, but we do know that children with cerebral palsy are at certain levels of risk. Children with autism also at risk. A few slides back, we talked about most of the states have a definitional requirement that a child must demonstrate a significant delay in one or more areas of development or domain of development. And here are some of the standard domains which you're familiar with, I'm sure. And once again, early childhood education majors are certainly familiar with the domains and should understand the relationship between the domains, developmental delay in the domains, and eligibility for early intervention. And also, by the way, the fact that for some children, they may have delays in almost all of those areas or multiple areas as a result of the nature of their disability. And another definition of at risk is any child experiences a substantial developmental delay would be at further risk if early intervention services were not provided. Here are just a couple of general indicators. Once again, in webinar 4 that Dr. Dinaville conducted in May, there's much more detail here about risk status, etc. But this is certainly appropriate content for the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course or the Child Development course, depending on within the Early Childhood Education or the Early Childhood Education Teacher Prep program where you allocate your content. But certainly in one of these two courses, discussion of risk factors and some of the specifics. And here's an overview of the IFSP, which once again would be something that an early childhood education teacher should be aware of. Depending on their classroom responsibilities post-graduation, federal law is very clear. Both the IFSP and the individual education planning process, IEP process, should actively seek to engage individuals who are involved in the life of the child, which quite specifically in this case can mean daycare providers, preschool teachers, and etc. So individuals who might find employment in the child care program might have a 2-year-old child with an IFSP. So it would be important for them to understand that they're a key player, that they might be part of the IFSP team or might be asked to contribute information or participate as a member of the team. They should have some understanding of what is an IFSP and what's the mandate for the IFSP and which agencies deliver those services. So here's some basic information on the process and content of an IFSP. I should go in the same direction. There we go. And this is just basic overview information that should be presented to undergraduate students or students seeking an associate or 4-year degree. The IFSP, once again, is a guiding document. It absolutely determines what services will be provided, where they'll be provided, by whom they'll be provided, how often they'll be provided, and other very specific information, which is an assurance not only for the team but also for the family with respect to what their expectations are for the focus and the content of the early intervention experience. This is kind of redundant, I just noticed. We sort of touched on that material, but we now have a picture of a little kid, so that's nice. So Part C services in Ohio are under the auspices of the Help Me Grow agencies across the state. Here's a snapshot of the website, the Help Me Grow website under the Ohio Department of Health. And there's plenty of content there, and certainly accessing this website would be more than appropriate within the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course, or requiring students to access this website and mine some information as part of an assignment would also be appropriate to give them to give you some general confidence that they understand the mandate for services for infants with delays or disabilities birth to 3 and the scope of those services, and within any one of the 88 counties in Ohio who provides those particular services. Who refers children to early intervention and early childhood special ed programs? Well, here's another listing, and as you can see, the third one down says preschool teachers, second one child care providers. So in fact, once again, looking at the NAEYC, for me to say, the NAEYC standard related to advocacy, the competent early childhood educator must be aware of which agencies provide basic intake information, screening, and referral, so that as practitioners, as child care providers or preschool teachers, if they think there are developmental indicators for a particular child, and they've had this conversation with parents, and parents do not seem to be aware of what their rights are or which agencies would be appropriate for them to refer their child, the competent early childhood education professional should have some awareness of the Part C programs as well as Part B 619, which we'll be getting to. So this is just a sample of how early intervention and early childhood special ed services can be provided. Once again, the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course talks about students being aware of the range of early childhood services that are available. And this is just an example. And a few more slides that will describe the scope of early intervention services. The interesting thing about the IFSP, or the birth to 3 services, are, we'll go back a slide, it's a broader scope than the services for 3 to 5-year-old children or 3 to 22 children. An example of medical services for diagnostic or evaluation purposes. A much broader mandate in the individual family services plan. Service coordination services, that's a little redundant, but I think you get the idea. Service coordination would have been sufficient, but the idea that there's also an individual on the IFSP team or somebody designated by the IFSP team to serve as a coordinator to ensure services are provided and to assist parents in understanding the scope of services and to help them coordinate services. Health services also provided. Assistive technology, which was the subject of a previous webinar. I don't know which webinar now. It might have been webinar 2, but in any event, there is a webinar stored at the Partner Project site which goes into some detail about assistive technology devices and assistive technology services. I had just mentioned the service coordination function, which is unique to the IFSP. And this is just a listing of the individuals who might be involved with an infant and toddler who has an IFSP under IDEA Part C, who might be identified as persons that provide services to children and their families. So once again, important with respect to advocacy for early childhood teachers to understand where they fit in the continuum and to recognize that if they do have 1 or 2 or 3 children who are at risk or have an IFSP, if they're child care providers, they may be encountering professionals from a number of different disciplines. They may be receiving communications from these professionals. They may also be needing to communicate information on the child's behavior, the child's performance, the child's response to changes in medication and the like to some of these practitioners or some of these professionals. And the big question, once again, looking at advocacy is early intervention effective? And in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course, the students should understand that early intervention is, again, a mandated public service. It is based on tax dollars, and so the issue becomes, has early intervention been effective? And these are just some benchmarks which suggest that, in fact, the money that society has spent providing services to infants, toddlers, and their families has been money well spent. Yeah, it's important to note that special education, fortunately, is not obligated to cure children, but one of the redeeming characteristics of special education in the absence of curing individuals, that early intervention and early special education might have the effect of the child needing an elementary school or high school student, and that translates in cost savings. So it's important to note, in addition to the humane and educational aspects, there's a fiscal aspect to early intervention. And to date, the data suggests that early intervention is an effective, efficient use of money, public funds. So moving on now to the school mandate, 3 to 5-year-olds, Part B, Section 609, once again of IDEA 2004. So we just left Part C services, which addressed from birth to 3. We're now moving into the next cohort, which is limited to preschool age children 3 to 5. The process for identification and service is very similar to Part C, so the IFS. So children ages 3 to 2, it's important for childhood education majors to understand that these children have an IEP, an individual education plan, which is designed by a team of individuals, and that children may be in a classroom who have an IEP. And as a result of their having an IEP, a number of different things occur, and we'll talk about service delivery models here in a bit. But one thing that may occur is they may have a special education teacher visit them on a regular basis, provide information to them about how to interact effectively with this child, and actually engage in practices to help them master certain teaching skills and the like, and helping them to be more observant and to be better prepared to monitor or to verify the progress of the child in response to these special education practices. So as I mentioned, the IEP is very similar to an IFSP, and it is the guide for child's education. It includes annual goals and specifies what kind of special education services will be received. Yeah, that's a typo there. I can fix that before it's posted. It'll specify the setting in which the services will be delivered, the LRE option. So, in Ohio, who's responsible for providing special education services to 3 to 5-year-olds? This is certainly another question that any graduate of an early childhood education teacher preparation program should be able to address once again to function as an advocate. And just to refresh our collective memories, we talked about entry-level skills. It does not mean that an individual who graduates from a 2-year associate's degree program in early childhood education would be an expert on Part C and Part B 619 services. But they certainly should understand the fundamental guarantees of those services, who provides those services, and what the basics of those services are. So, who's responsible for providing special education services to 3 to 5-year-olds in Ohio? It falls on the shoulders of the local education, the local school district, or the local education agency, which in federal law is known as LEA. I believe I addressed that in a future slide. And in Ohio, there are approximately 614 local school districts in the 88 counties in Ohio. Some school districts provide special education services, usually smaller districts, and for any number of particular difficulty recruiting licensed staff, costs, the benefits of sharing costs with other smaller districts, may subcontract special education services to the education service centers, ESCs, or boards of developmental disability, and other agencies. But those would be the two primary providers of early childhood special education services who are not the public school. The regionalized, formerly kind of Board of Ed, now Education Service Center agencies, or County Board of Developmental Disability, formerly the County Boards of MRDD in Ohio. This is the website for the Ohio Department of Education, the preschool SPED area. And once again, this would be an appropriate assignment, or certainly an appropriate discussion in the Intro to Early Childhood Education class about who's responsible, what are the basic services provided, who provides those services for children with special needs, just 3 to 5. So the next question becomes, okay, if these agencies, the Local Education Agency, or LEA, that's the acronym that's used in IDEA, if they're responsible for providing services, what exactly are they responsible for providing? And this is a relatively simple concept that all early childhood education teachers should understand. That the individual education plan clearly, specifically, stipulates what services are going to be provided to a 3 to 5-year-old child who qualifies for special education services. The IEP specifies the nature and intensity of the services, and often a specific schedule or some type of guidelines for how often, the frequency with which the service will be delivered. And the content of the IEP is determined exclusively by the IEP team. So once again, IEP individual education plan, one would expect that in looking at IEPs from 3 different 4-year-old children, that you would not have the same objectives, because once again, these are individualized, they're created by a team of people. There are minimum numbers of individuals or requirements who should be on the team, but the composition of IEP teams can change from one child to the next and one district to the next. Second aspect about who provides these services are that anybody who provides services to children with IEPs, ages 3 to 5, is a representative of the local school district in which the child's family resides, and that individual must be licensed or validated by the Ohio Department of Education. So, for example, preschool teachers who have children with IEPs that are employed by public school districts usually hold an early childhood education license or a preschool special needs validation. There are 3 primary service deliveries used by most school districts in Ohio to provide services to 3 to 5-year-olds who have IEPs. And once again, it's fairly straightforward and is certainly appropriate information for childhood education, teacher ed. So, the option is the public school district operates a preschool the direction of a licensed teacher. Related services, and I'll describe those further down in this slide. We looked at the whole list of service providers in early intervention, but if you're not familiar with the term services, and certainly some of your students may not, let's identify all of those individuals who may be involved with a child IEP. Not every child and not every individual with every child, but the range of services which could be brought to bear an IEP team if they felt appropriate, if they felt it was appropriate for a child to meet the objectives identified in his individual education plan. A second option for service delivery is the public school district provides services to a child with IEP, even though the child's enrolled in a Head Start program or a private for-profit program like Montessori, or any number of the range of not-for-profit preschool programs, church-based programs, publicly funded through other agency programs. In this particular case, if the IEP team supports the continued placement of this child with an IEP in a preschool program that is not operated by the local public school, the IEP team will typically designate an itinerant teacher who is an employee of that school district who will visit the child on typically a weekly schedule and will work with the child and the lead teacher and other adults in the classroom to address the objectives in the child's IEP. That may take the form of what we call direct service, where the itinerant teacher may spend time teaching or working directly with the child, as well as consultation services, where the itinerant teacher will work with the preschool teacher to show her certain strategies that she can use in interacting with this child that are related to his potentially achieving those IEP objectives identified by the IEP team as critical. Related services, once again, if they're identified in the IEP, also going to be provided. And the final option, or the third most typical option, are visiting the child in his home, and those visits also are typically conducted by an itinerant teacher and or related services professionals also employed by the district or contracted by the district, like speech pathologists, occupational therapists, and physical therapists. Those are the three most commonly encountered related services professionals who also provide services to children with IEPs and IFSPs, but specifically children in this case with IEPs. So once again, with the mandate for placement and delivery of services in the least restrictive environment, we have a continuum here of options where a child could be in a classroom operated by a local public school, which could have, for example, 6 children with special needs and 6 children with who are typically developing in that particular classroom, a 50-50 type classroom. It could also be that children with IEPs are enrolled in community-based programs, whether publicly supported or for-profit or not-for-profit, and the individual child still receives mandated services under IDEA through an itinerant teacher and related services professionals if that's appropriate. And the third venue would be the child is in his home for any number of different reasons. Medically, the child could be medically fragile. It could be a transition issue. It could be a family preference, whatever the IEP team has determined to be the least restrictive placement. And in which case, if the child is going to be served in the home, licensed individuals from the local school district will visit the family home and work with the child and with the other adults in the home, focusing their attention on the IEP objectives. So what are some of the early childhood settings in which inclusion is supported that are likely to be encountered by an early childhood education graduate? So the first stop there is, well, what exactly is the LRE? We've had some previous conversation in our webinar. On one level, this is fairly concrete. You know, the LRE is any of the possible environments in which a child, in this case, age 3 to 5, could be expected to participate or be educated. And we've already looked at some of those other options. The issue with the least restrictive environment is, and this is where the subtlety comes in, the IEP team looks at the developmental needs of this child based on the contributions of the members of the team, and at that point makes a decision about which environment would allow this child maximum interaction with typically developing peers, but yet still would provide the basic support necessary for us to reasonably expect this child would meet IEP at the end of that year. There isn't a specific formula. Every child looks this way, doesn't go to this type of placement. And you might have 2 children who look very similar developmentally. You may end up in 2 different placements for different reasons, or 2 different types of placements under the least restrictive environment considerations in the IEP process. Head Start is certainly one high-profile, federally funded public agency in which children with disabilities, in this case children with IEPs, and in the early Head Start, children with IFSPs, may be enrolled. Head Start is particularly noteworthy because they have always had a mandate for minimum percentage of their enrollment of children who have disabilities. This goes back to 1972, and this has remained constant. Over my career, even though the Head Start mandate is all-inclusive with respect to degree of severity and type of disability conditions, including, as the slide has in quotes, severely handicapped children, I think it's reasonable to say in most Head Start programs who have children with IEPs, which would be all Head Start programs, the majority of those children enrolled in Head Start with disabilities have what we might call high incidence or milder forms of disabilities. Communication and language disorders, mild cognitive impairment, mild behavioral problems, these kind of issues, rather than children with very significant or multi-handicapping conditions or very severe sensory impairments like hearing loss or deafness or blindness. The data I found indicated that currently 12.5% of children who attend Head Start have an identified disability. That's 1 out of 8. So once again, it is important to bring to the attention of early childhood teacher education candidates that Head Start, which is a large employer of early childhood education majors, approximately 1 out of 8 children in Head Start, and this does not even speak to the at-risk aspect of Head Start with respect to poverty and challenges to literacy and the like, that 1 out of 8 children in Head Start have been identified with a disability. And that would suggest that the majority of those 1 out of 8, or 12.5%, probably children who come to Head Start with an IEP. Some of you are familiar with the Head Start model, and the teachers should also be aware that Head Start also has kind of a parallel disability intervention model, a disabilities coordinator within Head Start, and Head Starts typically work very closely with local school districts in terms of coordinating special education services. So the itinerant model we just mentioned, where a public school special education teacher or related services professional would visit those students in Head Start who are identified with a disability by virtue of having an IEP. It's a very standard model. Head Start typically does not hire a cadre of related services professionals to meet the needs of their children with IEPs. Typically that is a contract, so to speak, with the local education agency. Yeah, there's a little redundancy, nothing wrong with a little redundancy every now and then. We talked earlier in the webinar about which skills need to be acquired early, which skills need to be refined, which skills need to be practiced. And in this particular case, it's very important for teachers to understand, or future teachers to understand, that Head Start has a mandate to serve children with disabilities, and that mandate sets a minimum percentage or number of children enrolled in Head Start. And in some cases, children with disabilities, depending on the location of Head Start, if they don't meet income qualifications, they can be admitted to Head. The income would be waived. And I just spoke about the requirement to coordinate program efforts with Part C and Part B 619 services. Here are a couple of slides. Disability resources. These may have previous webinars. Once again, nothing wrong with redundant. The key recommendation here is visit some of these sites, download some of these materials, use some of the audio visuals that are available in modules, etc. from these sections. There's a lot of funds and professional energy devoted to building high-quality resources. It would be quite helpful in teacher education case. These are resources, or these are sites where the content is dedicated to Head Start programs. All right, let's look at integrated activities in instruction in inclusive settings. This was one of the, related to one of the NAEYC standards for early childhood education students. So what's the definition of an inclusive environment? Well, this is a very broad definition, but what we're looking at here is opportunity to participate with typically developing peers, to support all members in an active democratic society. And the way we do, this is just a very global interview. We've also, very global treatment of this. We have addressed some of this content in previous webinars in a little more detail as well. But the idea here, the current perspective in early childhood special education is that within inclusive environments, what special education attempts to do is to embed teaching strategies that will address the IEP needs of the child within the regular early childhood curriculum. So we don't develop a parallel early childhood special education curriculum or parallel or different activities. What we do is examine the typical routines and activities in a preschool classroom, and we match the learning needs of the child as identified in the IEP with some modifications, adaptations, materials, interaction with peers, and some specific and direct instruction related to some of the key IEP objectives. And here's a good working definition from the Connect modules, which are an excellent source of content for syllabus development in early childhood education. Yeah, so once again, looking for opportunities within routines or activities that occur on a regular basis within this preschool classroom. That's when we embed specialized instruction that is specific to the IEP objectives for the child. Here's a single example of environmental modification. Nobody's harmed here with respect to typically developing kids. This is just a little sequence board that may be reassuring for a child with mild autism or another child who has some attentional problems. This will allow them to have a context for what's the sequence of activities, what are we doing. And here's just an unpaid announcement about adaptations, that in fact adaptations once again can be helpful to all children. In our specific case, we're interested in how to adapt materials and activities without changing the materials and activities with respect to having a separate activity. How to adapt activities so that children with disabilities can participate at the level of competence that they bring to the activity. Mentioned peer supports, and this is quite simply making judgments about pairing typical peers, specific typical peers, with children with special needs to support their development. And there's a rich body of research with respect to strategies, the use of very basic scripts to help train typically developing peers how to interact with children with disabilities around a specific developmental skill name. Early childhood education majors should at least be aware that within the IDEA mandate, there is a mandate for inclusion and interaction with typical peers. And the implication is, once again, to support the development of the child with disabilities, in addition to the humane and democratic characteristics of participation. There are educational benefits for interacting with typically developing peers who provide models, who provide encouragement, who provide correction, who provide motivation. Now here are a series of slides which we're not going to go through slide by slide by slide, and once again there may be a bit of an overlap with webinar 4, although I looked and the content is different, and this once again relates to where does this content go, and I'm guessing once again based on looking at a couple of syllabi of the Intro to Early Childhood Education course. In some cases this content goes into the Child Development course, in other situations it's embedded in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course. So this is just some other resources. Some basic information for early childhood education majors. And these numbers fluctuate, but In general, I think it's reasonable to expect that 12 to 16%, or between 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 8 children in preschool will be identified as having a developmental or behavior disorder. The second stat is interesting, and this is something the Department of Ed is always focused on, and that is earlier and more aggressive identification, because we know what the benefits of early identification are. Look at that statistic, that a significant number of children with disabilities are not identified before school, and certainly a number of these children are children who have they're showing some developmental characteristics that are later associated with learning disabilities, which was a very high incidence condition of 6 to 22-year-old children, and also children who unfortunately are beginning to evidence some significant behavioral disorders, who that may become more clear, unfortunately, and the severity of those disorders may increase as children move into elementary school. And here's some basic questions that would be appropriate discussion points in an Introduction to Early Childhood course. Under IDEA, can public schools choose not to provide education for some students with disabilities? Is the LRE always the regular general education classroom? Is disproportionate representation of ethnic minorities in special education still a problem? Is disability ever related to ethnicity? Those are just some kind of global conversation points that might be helpful in pulling out of students some of the myths and perhaps some of the inaccurate information they may have, that once again, if we can shed some light on that, we can probably correct that for the benefit of all of the students. This just simply identifies the special education disability categories, which are some of these conditions certainly exist in preschool. Once again, we're not obligated to identify children by this particular disability category in preschool. And the footnote on the right column indicates learning disability. While it is a very high incidence special education condition, school-age ability, and is clearly related to dysfunction in reading and writing and the like, and it's much more apparent as K to 4, and certainly grades K to 6. A bunch of slides. Once again, the PowerPoints are posted that you can choose to download, edit, embed in your courses if you find them relevant. It's just some basic overview questions about communication disorders, similar to the conversation or the probe questions we just had about what are the requirements for services for children with disabilities. The children with language disorders always have speech difficulties. Do they have emotional or behavioral disorders and mental retardation? Are articulation problems very serious? Is there much of an overlap between language disorders and learning disability? Can peer modeling, will that be the solution for most kids who have language difficulties before kindergarten? Autism, very high incidence condition now. Depending on the statistics you're looking at, I think we're certainly comfortable saying that somewhere between 1 in 80 to 1 in 150 children now have some characteristics or symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. These are just some of them. Well, there's the data right there proving I can remember my slides ahead. A lot of information here about what autism is, that it is a spectrum disorder, what are the primary characteristics. The odds are extremely high that every graduate of an early childhood education, teacher education program, within the first year or two of their employment will have a child with some degree of autism in their classroom. I can't imagine the circumstances under which an early childhood classroom teacher would be out there for several years without having a child in her classroom who evidences some characteristics of autism or has been identified as a child with autism. A bunch of characteristics that Once again, in an assignment that might require a student to look a little more carefully at disability. This would be good resource data. ADHD, which is interesting, something like autism with respect to high probabilities of encountering children who are excessively active, and this is certainly a hotbed of discussion right now. Are kids over-identified, under-identified, over-medicated, under-medicated? That would be several distinct webinars in themselves, which we obviously won't be going into. Certainly, every graduate of an early childhood education teacher ed program should be aware of the characteristics and categorizations of children with attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And here are some characteristics. Important to note with both autism and ADHD as well, just a little sidebar, they're both medical diagnoses. They're not educational diagnoses. So, once again, in our advocacy issues, and there's another course that talks about professional ethics, we need to make sure students understand that they're not in a position to make any diagnostic recommendations, so to speak. That they really shouldn't be approaching parents or other adults saying, I think he's ADHD, I think he has autism. Once again, both of those diagnoses are outside of education arena. Cognitive impairment, developmental delay. This is an interesting couple of slides here which talk about developmental delay, and certainly in in preschool special education, for so many reasons, we're much more reluctant to identify ability and much more like about a generalized delay. And so discussion of that is also appropriate within the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course. And here's some information, or that information was related to children with cognitive delay. Physical and other health impairments, much less likely. Certainly if they're going to have a child with a physical disability, the odds are, the best odds would be a child with cerebral palsy. Certainly epilepsy is another health impairing condition. Asthma, which once again is prevalent, but is, the greatest risk with asthma is school absenteeism and potential effects on development. A few once again talking points: of cerebral palsy, a disease. Is it true that physical disabilities are decreasing because of medical advances? The more severe a child's physical disability, the lower their intelligence. Those are questions for conversation. Hearing impairment, once again, very low incidence, or very, very unlikely that a teacher is going to encounter a significant number of kids with hearing impairment, and even less likely with vision impairment. Every now and then, once in a while, but it wouldn't be near the probabilities of children with autism, children with cognitive impairments, children with behavior disorders. And some other discussion questions. Deafness, lip reading, American Sign Language, visual impairment. And that statistic of 1 out of 200 children is very generous. It could be more like 1 out of 1,000 children. I think we can agree that it is extremely rare to have a child in preschool who is blind or severely visually impaired. Vision impairment is primarily a disorder of adults. Questions about do children who are legally blind have any sight? Some of these other issues about other senses, use of Braille. Should children in preschool start mobility training? Giftedness, I'm going to just zip right through most of these, but it's important within this. Once again, one of the NAEY standards and one of the elements in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course talked about the range of abilities and disabilities, and this is certainly the other side of the rainbow, so to speak, children who are gifted. Every preschool teacher is going to run into some kids that are pretty precocious, pretty advanced, pretty analytic, pretty interesting. So important to at least understand who these kids are, and quite frankly to understand that they do not have the same guarantees as a child who has a disability. Kids who are gifted are not covered under IDEA and do not receive any special services. All right, so you know, we're getting toward the end here. So one of the issues would be, if an instructor was going to add content related to inclusion in the Introduction to Early Childhood Education course, how would he or she do that? You know, it might be necessary every now and then, I would say on a limited basis, to create a separate assignment or an additional assignment relating to that content. Another easier way to manage that would be to just simply add a component to an existing assignment, which in a sense is an inclusive option, isn't it? And kind of mirrors the process of inclusion. Now, here's an example. An element could be added to an assignment that requires a student to locate a website that provides information on eligibility requirements for preschool-age children with special needs, and then a website that describes Part B 619 services, and then some focusing questions about you know, what services they provide, what are their responsibilities for this, that, and the like. Once again, to kind of probe what early childhood education teachers know about the complementary services available in the early childhood profession for infants, toddlers, and preschool children with special needs. Here's another example, locating a website, and you know, once again, it could be an article that you post, a PDF that you post up on a website that you've selected. It could be open-ended, where they are going to find websites related to a high incidence condition, autism, communication disorder, cognitive impairment, ADHD, etc. Describe some number of those characteristics and indicate how they might have an impact on the child's participation in the classroom. And then the third component of that embedded assignment would be to describe what community agencies might be engaged with the child with this particular condition. Yeah, we are literally almost done with the webinar, and I'm going to just back up for a second just to point out there are numbers of different examples. The reason I created a couple was once again just to provide some concrete suggestions for how assignments could be modified. And I do think that it is appropriate to embed alternative assignments or additional content related to inclusion in existing assignments rather than to create additional or parallel assignments. I think once again this models the process of inclusion, the thinking of inclusion, and also kind of reinforces the idea of membership, that children with special needs are part of the early childhood continuum, they're part of the early childhood classroom, and they are the responsibility of the preschool teacher. They are not allocated or what's the word I'm looking for? The preschool teacher doesn't abdicate responsibilities for the development of this particular child to a special education teacher who visits once a week or some other related services person. The early childhood teacher sees herself as an agent and an advocate for this particular child, and sees this child with an IEP as just as much a member of her classroom as the typically developing children. And I think, once again, if we can embed content and observation requirements and field experiences and accessing of resources related to inclusion within the typical assignments in any of the early childhood courses in the curriculum, I think that may be a better model. This is clearly just a bunch of an inventory of developmental red flags that, once again, when this PowerPoint's posted, if you have a course, you don't have that material available, rather than do it yourself, just jump in, cut and paste it, move it into your presentation, take it out and put it up on the website for your course as something students can look to. And we'll end with just a description, once again, of a number of resources that are available, online resources which have extensive content. You know, the reason that we put the webinars together is to, you know, make life a little bit easier for you. We obviously can't capture the exhaustive information that's available on the internet from some of these incredibly sophisticated public agencies and university websites, etc. But we certainly want to refer you to these websites, but as well as providing you with at least some basic content that you can just simply download, highlight, cut and paste, and move into your instructional syllabus. And these are just some web pages and the identification of the agencies that support these websites. This is a very good tool here, the Crosswalk's website. Yeah, and the Connect modules as well, which once again have a lot of really good teaching resources that you can incorporate right into your syllabi and into your class presentations, web links that you can just click on, and that'll move you to video snippets and exercises in class, etc. So, you know, I was a faculty member for a long time at the University of Toledo, and you know, I often got stuck with inventing things that were already out there. I got much smarter as I got older, had a little more experience, and I'm suggesting the same thing to you. Take the hour and a half, 2 hours before you develop the syllabus and look around at some of this content, and don't invent it yourself if you don't have to. In this particular case, the Connect people, the people behind the Connect modules are very competent, very dedicated, very focused, and many of them aren't teaching faculty, so they have a lot of time on their hands, so to speak, more time than you do. So take advantage of what they offered you, you know, publicly supported by U.S. Department of Education money. Take advantage of the content in these Connect modules and incorporate them into your courses. Another excellent site, TOTS and Tech, and as I mentioned, I should know, but unfortunately I can't recall. But one of the earlier webinars, webinar 1, 2, or 3, focused on assistive technology and the like, and there's a bunch of stuff in those slides that you might find relevant. And I believe that brings us to our conclusion. So I appreciate your being with me tonight. The webinar will be posted as a YouTube video, easy to go through, and then we'll also post the PowerPoints separately. You'll be notified of that through the partner project. So once again, you can come in and peruse the previous PowerPoints and this one as well. And if you see anything in there while you're shopping, simply cut and paste and import it over into your own materials. Our next webinar will be in July. There'll be information posted, and there'll also be another webinar in August. So we appreciate your interest, and we hope that we've been able to provide some information that you found helpful. Best wishes, and enjoy the weather. Thank you. Good night.